Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today, which is all about civil service relations with ministers, what's gone wrong and how to fix it. I'm Siobhan Benita. I'm a former UK civil servant myself, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, which is a publishing house that serves civil servants here in the UK and all around the world. So I think it's true to say that the relationship between civil servants and ministers in the UK is under significant strain. Resignations of top officials and ministers have become a pretty regular occurrence, with accusations of bullying and code breaking on one side and blocking activism and most recently wokeism on the other. A long-awaited review by former Cabinet Office Minister Francis Maude into civil service governance and accountability is expected soon, and we will hear more about that in a moment. But today we're going to be joined by four fantastic experts who will give us their reflections on the relationship between ministers and officials, what happens when that goes wrong, and the scope for reforms to rebuild the confidence both of ministers and civil servants. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our speakers and I'm going to invite them to give some opening remarks. But there will be time after our panel have spoken for you, our audience, and I know most of you will be serving UK civil servants yourselves, to put your questions to our panel. So whichever device you are using today, you should see a Q&A function on your screen. Please, at any time from now, use that Q&A function to send in your questions, and we'll get through as many of those as we can before the end of today's webinar. But now let me introduce our panel. So first we will hear from Richard Johnstone, who is Executive Editor of Global Government Forum. He produces editorial analysis and insight for its audience of public servants around the world. Richard has worked in public policy journalism all his career, and before joining GGF, he was acting editor at Civil Service World, which you may all be familiar with as well. Then we will hear from Andrew Kakabadze, who is Professor of Governance and Leadership at Henley Business School and Emeritus Professor at Cranfield School of Management. His research covers boards, top teams, and the governance of governments, and he's published extensively, is an advisor to numerous governments and NGOs, including the UK Parliament, and he undertook a review of ministerial and civil service relationships, particularly relevant for today. And then joining us, you may not be able to see him yet, but I'm assured he will be joining us very soon. He's listening and he just needs to be able to get to a space to turn his camera on, is Jonathan Slater, who is former Permanent Secretary for the Department for Education. He's now a visiting professor at King's College London and Queen Mary's University London. Throughout his 20-year civil service career, he worked in Justice, Defence, Cabinet Office and Number 10, as well as ending in education. Before the civil service, he worked in local government for more than 10 years, where he was Director of Education and Deputy Chief Executive at Islington Council. And Jonathan has also written on kind of fixing Whitehall's broken policy machine. And then last, but by no means least, I'm delighted we're joined by Lucille Philby, who is Assistant General Secretary of the FDA and has been a trade union leader for over 20 years. Until recently, Lucille had strategic responsibility for civil service pay, the SCS, pensions and Cabinet Office engagement. And in her current position, she leads the strategic development of the FDA learning and organisation, equality and also union communications. So I'm sure you will agree with me, we really do have a great panel with us here today. As I said, please do take this opportunity to message in your questions and we will get through those once we have heard from our speakers. But on that note, I'm now going to invite Richard to kind of set the scene for us with some opening remarks. Over to you, Richard.
Great, thanks, Siobhan. And yes, indeed, I just wanted to provide a sort of overview of the relations between ministers and civil servants before we hear from the other members of the panel. How ministers work with their permanent secretaries in their department and indeed by extension their private offices and wider departmental officials is the key relationship in driving delivery in government, and there's kind of no doubt that that relationship can be fraught. Ministers are responsible for the workings of their department to Parliament, which is an extremely high-pressured responsibility, but it can be difficult for ministers to be aware of all that's happening in every corner of their department. add into that kind of long-standing responsibility the tumult of modern politics, the quickened news cycles and the development of a more partisan world around social media, and it becomes clear why this relationship seems to be under increasing pressure. But as I say, it has always been under pressure. Civil servants and ministers have butted heads before, and when they've not got on in the past, often officials have been moved into other posts, and there's been kind of managed moves around the system. But in recent years, it does feel like the dynamic has changed somewhat. We can all discuss the reasons for this, and I'm keen to hear reflections from the panel. But I think that the word of recent years has been perma-crisis, and the perma-crisis the UK has faced, both in its politics and its constitutional structure since 2016, seems to have upped the ante on this relationship. And one does perhaps draw the line back to 2016 and the Brexit referendum. It shook the political kaleidoscope, as referendums often do. And the old permanent secretary responsibility and civil service responsibility for speaking truth to power about the deliverability or the benefits of a particular policy or project was now the kind of thing that was being briefed to newspapers as blocking behaviour, as the work of some kind of establishment blob trying to thwart the work of government. That is kind of a new thing, and I think you can date that back to the referendum, and it's been accentuated in the years that followed. Philip Rutnam resigned as Permanent Secretary from the Home Office on a Saturday morning, saying that the Home Secretary had bullied staff, and that was something that was upheld, remember, by the Prime Minister's advisor on the Ministerial Code, but not accepted by Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister, who kept Patel in place. I still vividly remember sitting at home when the news of Jonathan's departure came through and being kind of shocked about how it had happened. It seemed so outside the normal ways of running government, but it now seems to be becoming more routine, and that's probably something we want to reflect on. Liz Truss's short premiership ended due to her and her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng's kind of economic judgments and misjudgments, you might say, but these might have been less profound, both for the country and for her time as Prime Minister, if they had not sacked the Treasury Permanent Secretary Tom Scholar in their first days in office. And I wonder, perhaps optimistically, if history will judge that as a kind of the low point in civil service ministerial relationships, and one from which they can begin to be rebuilt. Because I think there was a lot of shock around the dismissal of Tom Scholar, and whether that is the point from which we can begin to look and see changes. I don't know, but that kind of sticks in my mind. But there's clearly still dissatisfaction in the relationship between ministers and officials. Dominic Raab resigned last month after a bullying inquiry found he'd acted in an intimidating and aggressive way towards officials, but Raab's claimed that the inquiry was flawed and sets a dangerous precedent on how you can provide clear and robust feedback to officials. So again, keen to hear from the panel about how trust can be rebuilt between ministers and officials. There are some ideas that we know are being considered, as Siobhan mentioned, a review of the civil service governance and accountability led by former Cabinet Office Minister Lord Francis Maude, who led a lot of civil service reforms when he was in the Cabinet Office, looks set to call for greater ministerial involvement in the appointment of top officials. He's written an article to that effect, with Singapore and France among the nations that could be used as examples. Other ideas include clarifying the responsibilities of ministers and permanent secretaries. That comes from the Institute for Government and the Bennett Institute for Public Policy, and perhaps even taking responsibility for some elements of the departments from ministers, the parliamentary responsibility. Siobhan mentioned Jonathan's paper for the King's College, looking at how to overhaul policy making, to improve delivery, and perhaps by extension ministerial confidence by making civil servants accountable for advice they provide, and the advice that they give to ministers, including them to kind of respond openly to select committee questions. So I think there's an interesting discussion about what comes next, because as the chair of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Select Committee, William Wragg said when launching their inquiry into civil service leadership and reform just last month. It is a fundamental principle that the civil service serves the government of the day, yet growing tensions between ministers and their officials and public criticisms of civil service impartiality and competence have called into question the efficacy of the Westminster model. And looking back on the last 5-6 years or so, it's perhaps wishful thinking to hope that another change or two of Prime Minister will lead to those questions going away, and perhaps we need to look a little bit at what can be the elements of a new settlement between ministers and civil servants. So that's just hopefully a useful overview before we hear from the rest of the panel.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Richard. Really helpful to have that kind of setting the scene. I think a couple of things to pick out, as you said there, it's a very high pressured environment, real pressure on ministers in particular to deliver quickly. But as you said, hasn't that always been the case? So maybe what's different now? Can we trace some of this particular toxicity back to Brexit, that sense that ministers, maybe some of the ministers really believing that the civil service was trying to block what they wanted to do. Those examples that you gave of kind of officials being fired, of ministers leaving, of not accepting, maybe bullying examples as well. So that real need for trust to be rebuilt, however we are able to do that. And then looking ahead, do we need a new model? Do we need to kind of fundamentally rethink some of the ways that we clarify the roles and responsibilities to make sure that relationship between ministers and the civil service is an effective one, because ultimately the civil service needs to serve ministers of the day, as you said. Thank you so much, Richard. Really helpful to set the scene. Andrew, I'm coming over to you for your thoughts now.
Siobhan, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was asked to look at the minister-civil servant relationship, but that was more an outcome. At the time when I was asked, it was more the functioning of government, and the guiding question was, is the civil service fit for purpose? Now, it was PACAC under Bernard Jenkins that was the sponsor. It took less than a week to recognize that the guiding question was simply inadequate. And the guiding question became, is government fit for purpose? The reason was I could not come up to any meaningful conclusion until the relationship between minister, the role of minister, the contribution of minister, and its interaction with the officials was at least part of the study or the investigation. Now, is this unusual? Absolutely not. In my view, not much has gone wrong. We have a tension that has been here for some time. The literature, if we go into the management, leadership and strategy side, says in one sense, more or less the same. A critical relationship is between the chair and CEO. You can have McKinsey's, any consulting organization you want, create the best strategy, and yet the chemistry between the chair and CEO could damage major corporations. And we saw it with RBS, with Marconi, and quite a few others, Kids Company. So what emerged from this investigation was very interesting. There is a tension, and it's probably the most complex tension I have seen. On the one hand, the Minister's Secretary of State, the demand for urgency. Here is an individual publicly exposed, needing to give commitment, needing to see through a manifesto, making comments at the dispatch box. But on the other hand, the implementation of that policy through the officials and being realistic about how we navigate through the different misalignments that are there, how we bring people on board, how we bring an engagement trust between the various interests that exist is the nature of the tension. Let's go back to 1986. In 1986, the Margaret Thatcher initiative of the Top Management Programme, which brought chairs, CEOs, private sector, public sector, with ministers, aspiring politicians, and especially with top civil servants, understood that tension. And what was the solution? Discussion, understanding each other, understanding that in this tension, there are different types of contributions that need to be made. And once that respect is there, that those contributions are in fact valuable, and although the tension is there and we can't get away from it, if we only harness that tension better, do you know what a better sort of government and ultimately a better society we would have? That was key. Do you know that of those that still live today, from the very first cohort in 1986, they still meet? and they still discuss. And some of them are acting as advisors, some in some form of employment, and they use that particular intimate conversation to enable them to do the jobs. We've lost that. It wasn't Brexit. In fact, under the Blair administration, that top management program was canned. And so what we lost with that tradition was the appreciation of complexity. And the tension is there for very good reasons. We need to be publicly accountable, and we also need to be able to see how to deliver on that strategy or policy in a way that works. So in fact, we have two different forms of time. We have quick time, which is the Secretary of State's time, understandable. We don't have slow time from the official, we have reflected time. And this is because we need to seriously think through exactly what's happening. We have a mountain of evidence from the private sector where good strategies created have gone wrong repeatedly. And that is because there isn't a 20-80 rule. 20% of your effort should be into the creation of a policy or strategy. 80% of your effort should be realistically understanding how to implement. What was I told in the investigation that I took by ministers? Exactly the same. And then you saw them at work. Because at work, under pressure, 20-80 turned into 80-20. And 80% of effort was trying to push something through. And what the official was saying, Minister, we understand that, but have you considered this? Have you considered how we need to take things step by step? So the first thing I concluded was the urgency versus realism tension is actually quite well understood by the officials. It's at the ministerial end that's the problem. When it came to then analyzing the officials, the sort of terms of blocker and holding things back, what did I notice? And I've worked with Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, Oman. I have never witnessed this anywhere in any corporation or in any government in the world. And that is a devotion. The British civil servant is devoted to their Secretary of State, not because of the role of the person, but because of the devotion to representative democracy. Here is a system that enables the population of this country to be able to indicate what sort of government, what sort of policies, what sort of life they should have. And the respect shown to that through the officials was immense. By nature of the fact that you are devoted to representative democracy, the focus on the Secretary of State and trying to enable the Secretary of State to implement the policies that they want just stood out. If we get rid of this, and I have great doubts about the Francis Maude oncoming investigation, we will have what we have in Australia or in so many other countries. You will not have independence and devotion and caring. You will simply have a transactional economy, which is actually what most of the private sector organizations have today. You want this? Well, I'll deliver it without thinking through the intricacies of the delivery process of a strategy or policy. So then I wondered, if that is the case, and I did see so much pressure on officials, and I did see ministers not wanting to hear the argument, and then I have to be very fair, and did see ministers changing their mind, that the officials actually may be right, and perhaps we both need to form a partnership. That took a little bit of time. What then did I see in the official? I saw a realistic appraisal of what the minister was going through. It wasn't as if I'm trying to help this policy through and I don't understand the constraints and pressures the minister is under. It was the exact opposite. In fact, to my surprise, I saw such a respect for the minister. And I do recall one official saying, the way I actually have that respect was a minister was in the office, we were all under pressure. And then one of the children of this particular minister rang and said, look, where's my bat? Obviously doing cricket. And the minister switched like that and went into where the home was, where the bat was, where this was, where that was. And when that was over, with the right tone of voice, went straight into the conversation as if that never took place. What impressed that official was how you could make such a switch intellectually and emotionally and engage with both parties, which were so far apart. The official said to me, few of us, namely civil servants, can do that. So I noticed tremendously high respect for the minister. And I do have to pose the question, why is that not returned? Because going public on our officials not being up to the job or not being good enough, I would like to ask which other country does that? Because I don't see officials going public that the minister, there's something wrong with them. I do see the other way around. I've not seen that to that extent in Australia, in New Zealand, in the Middle East, in the Far East, or even, if you like, in the United States. There is something here. We had a respect at one time and it was ingrained in the system. And now we've lost it and all that we have is distaste.
Andrew, thank you so much. Really interesting to hear what you said about the top management program, the one that you started in 1986, how they recognized the tension and then worked with that. So the importance of good communication, of valuing and respecting each other's contributions and the difference that make. You challenging, I think, Richard saying maybe this goes back to Brexit, saying actually this goes back a lot further than Brexit under New Labour when that top management program was stopped. So maybe this has been a decline since then, but really interesting to hear what you said now about the situation now and how there is a real risk when you look internationally, how from your experience of working with civil services around the world, how the British civil service really stands out because of its dedication and care, and a risk that if we move to a more politicized system, it would become much more transactional. And then that question, which I'd be interesting what Jonathan and Lucille think about this is, you know, civil servants have huge respect for their ministers from your experience. Why are we not seeing the other way round? So that question, do ministers not have sufficient respect for their officials? Thank you so much, Andrew. Fantastic presentation. Jonathan, nice to have you with us in the room, and we are coming over to you now, if that's okay.
Thanks very much. Delighted to join the conversation with the others. Fascinating already hearing from you, from Richard and from Andrew. So I've worked for 7 out of the last 9 Secretary of State for Education. 4 of them were my Secretary of State between 2016 and 2020. 3 of the last 5 I worked for when they were junior ministers. Enormous variety amongst those 7. Different classes, different races, different sex, different sexuality. Some of them were experienced already, cabinet ministers before they came to the department. Some had never done a Secretary of State job before. Some were confident in what they wanted to achieve, others not at all. Some have got a clear agenda, some not. Some were detail people, you know, would read everything you threw at them and want more. Others would rarely read anything. Some of them would phone you at 7 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. Others would never contact you at the weekends. So sort of huge variety because, you know, they're people, as Andrew pointed out, just like not just cabinet ministers. And so the civil service obviously has to be good at serving very different people very quickly. And generally, I think the civil service does it pretty well. I mean, the civil service spent a lot of time preparing for new ministers' arrival, and of course, in recent years, has had a great deal of experience of it, and so is, you know, very adept, I would say, at working out what the minister wants and giving it to them. I enjoyed working for 6 out of the 7 of them. Not so much with another one. Probably doesn't make sense in a forum like this to go and sort of name names. 6 out of 7 is not a bad ratio, as a matter of fact. If I think of the last 7 bosses that I had, you know, I mean line managers before I became a permanent secretary, I'm not sure I'd get a better ratio than that. Yes, there are bullies amongst ministers, which is really bad news, and it needs to be tackled. And there's bullying by civil servants, which needs to get tackled. You're much more likely, if you're a civil servant, to be bullied by another civil servant than by a minister, because most civil servants don't meet ministers. About 1 in 10 civil servants say in the Star survey each year that they've been bullied or harassed in the last 12 months. And most of those cannot have been bullied or harassed by a minister. So the sort of challenge of good quality leadership, the right sort of culture and behaviours and values, is important in every organisation. It's really important in government, and it's really important in the civil service, and it's important in journalism, and it's important in every walk of life. And I saw this at the top of my list of priorities as the permanent secretary, to reduce the number of people who felt they had been bullied or harassed, and to take action. It's not a new thing, and it's not just a political thing. And maybe it has a bigger impact the more powerful you are. But for the country as a whole, but for the individual, it's bad. Whether it's a politician, a journalist, a civil servant, or anybody else. And as I say, 6 out of 7, not a bad ratio, all post 2016. Just talking about my own experience, in one job. I've said that the civil service is good. Whitehall's good at working out what it is that ministers want and how best to give it to them. In fact, I'm going to suggest that we're perhaps a bit too good at it. We focus a bit too much of our attention on, I wonder what Justine Greening thinks, she's just arrived, or Gavin Williamson, or Damien Hines, or Michelle, or whoever it is. I remember actually Justine hadn't been Secretary of State very long before she received a submission saying, I understand this is the overall outcome you want, and you've got a range of different options, and here they all are. And Justine, through her private office, sent a message back to the official saying, thank you very much. What would your advice be? Which do you think of these various options would be the best? And the response she actually got back from the official was, well, it depends what you want. We're so focused on what is it that our minister wants that we find it really hard to do the truth to power. I mean, it's a great phrase, isn't it? Speaking truth to power. It makes you feel really good when you say it, but it's bloody hard to do, isn't it? I mean, and it's not just hard to do in Whitehall. It's hard in any walk of life. It's hard at home. Who wants to receive a message from somebody else telling them the thing they're really keen to do is a really bad idea, or it's not going to work? This is really hard in any walk of life. And it's very hard in the civil service because, inevitably you're a bit worried, aren't you? Whether your new political boss, if they are new, is going to welcome that advice, for all the obvious reasons that would be bound to be the case. And of course, you're not serving the minister at all well by, telling them what they want to hear. The truth to power is really important, but I would say it's not really a very strong feature of the Whitehall model in practice. One of the very first things I thought when I arrived in 2001 was, where's all this truth to power? I just don't see it. And I'm not blaming anybody for it. You can see why it wouldn't happen as much as we think it should. And it's really important that it should happen. When I made it a matter of principle, I was always attend induction meetings for all new starters in the Department of Education. And I would explain to the new starters the importance of knowing what they were talking about, understanding the political ambition, set out a range of options. And people more often than not at these induction meetings would say to me, but is that what they really want? Jonathan, is that what they really want? Right? These are people who have only just started, right? This is induction meetings. This is not people who've spent years in the civil service, bashed about by ministers who don't want to hear things. This is before the age of Dominic Cummings. Obviously, there was a particular Dominic Cummings thing where permanent secretaries were seen as blockers, and a number of us were pushed out, obviously. And there was a sort of Liz Truss thing as well. But these are generally the sort of exception, aren't they? Before that, obviously, if people do get pushed out, it's going to make people more anxious. But before that, this notion of, telling as it is, really saying what you think, people are nervous about it. They just are. And it doesn't serve anybody well. I mean, the system does require these ministers who don't really know anything about the subject. What was true of all of these 7 people, they hadn't got any background in education. They really needed the civil servants in the department to know about it and to tell them what they knew. And they would get frustrated that we didn't know and we wouldn't tell them. And that's a real problem. It really is a problem. And so that's what I've written about. How might one improve that situation? And I think a system which sort of, in which the policy making takes place in a closed room, not subject to any external scrutiny at all. If you want to know what my advice was, you've got to wait 20 years. 20 years? This is public money. When I was a local government official, if you wanted to know what my advice was, you find out on the day. You just go along to the education committee, and I would set out which school I thought should close to an open meeting. You know, and then a couple of miles away, when I move into Whitehall, suddenly can't possibly do that. I think a system in which our advice is more subject to public scrutiny and challenge would be much better policy making. We wouldn't be just working out what we think the minister wants and quite often getting it wrong. We would know that somebody was looking at, you know, that we had an inspectorate, like the Audit Commission used to do in local government. Is this policy advice any good? And we would be much more likely to speak truth to power. Ministers would be much better served, and our jobs would be much more effective. None of that, of course, would stop individual bullying, and that is a really important theme that needs to be addressed. But as I say, it's not unique. It really isn't unique to government. I hope those comments are helpful.
Jonathan, thank you so much. Very helpful, because I think you're bringing in lots of different perspectives there. So the way you said that bullying happens not just by ministers, but also from the kind of staff surveys. You can see this is an issue across the civil service and from officials as well. So it needs to be addressed in both those areas. And as you say, out of your 7 ministers that you worked with, all post 2016, 6 of them were good relationships. So would you have the same thing in a line management relationship as well? But fascinating the way you present it there then around speaking truth to power, which is kind of what all civil servants are told is the core of what they do in Whitehall, being a very difficult thing to do. And actually what you're saying is we need more of that. We need to be teaching officials how to do even more of that, and maybe that transparency of the advice being something that can help with that respect. I'll be really curious when we come to the conversation and to the audience who are listening, what they think about that issue, as you're saying, of speaking truth to power, whether they agree with you that maybe officials are too quick to try and second guess what ministers want from the start, rather than lay the options out in advance. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And a reminder before we come over to Lucille, to the audience, please do get your questions coming in, because we will be going to questions once we have heard from Lucille. So over to you, Lucille. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Really interesting contributions so far. I think it's really interesting to me. I think the notion of a war between civil servants and ministers or this government is a totally concocted proposition by either those who are not in government or those who are interested in diversionary tactics and creating a culture war. I think, like Jonathan's just said, our experience is the vast majority of those relationships are good, and they get that balance right in ensuring the best delivery of public services in line with the government policy. I think all the incidents that we're aware of are with individual ministers who have had serious personal failings of standards. All of these are separate and do not represent anything other than what they were individually. I think that the blob narrative anonymises responsibility, puts the blame on employees and leaders in the civil service for being the obstacle for reform, which actually isn't evidenced and does need to be challenged. I think the continuing attack on professionalism and integrity of the civil servants, particularly in this past year, many of our members continue to feel very angry and hurt by ministers using the media to brief against them, whether that's policy announcements on job cuts or removal of permanent secretaries, or unacceptable comments and behaviour around hybrid working. I mean, you just would not see this in private sector employers, nor if you were a leader of a local government council. They would not publicly berate their staff in the way that ministers feel able to do so. Alongside that, the civil service, senior civil service remains under considerable pressure. You know, we've got the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic, the war in the Ukraine, cost of living crisis, the exit from the EU, all exacerbated by that tumultuous period of politics over this past year. And at the point is that the civil service is at the forefront of responding to all of these multiple and complex challenges, and are expected to do that under considerable financial pressures and demands to do more with less. We know from our surveys that morale is worsening year on year. 77% of the SCS said that their morale had reduced since last year. They said there is no realistic view by ministers about how they're going to achieve their objectives in their working hours. They're describing the pace of work as relentless. Members report that ministers are not prioritising objectives or reducing workloads as headcounts reduce, and therefore that's unsustainable. And we need that better matching of resources to commitments. And I think I combine this with no progress on a government pledge to reform capability-based pay progression alongside the plummeting values of SCS salaries. Their pay hasn't increased since 2010. And alongside those comments from ministers demonstrating they don't value the civil service, and most of the civil servants are reaching the end of their tether. We do need change. We need the civil service to be valued. We need it invested in. We need that switch of culture of us and them, and rebuilding that trust and respect. But I think genuine reform does require a strategy and vision, but also that engagement and understanding. Andrew pulled this out really well, but it's not good enough for ministers to say, oh, I want change, but then not articulate what that is, or how they're prepared to work through those difficult conversations and processes that are extremely, urgently required. I mean, our employees do this on a daily basis, but maybe ministers need to get a better understanding of the art of the possible in relation to reform. Thank you.
Lucille, thank you so much. Again, bringing in a slightly different perspective there. So really setting out how a lot of your members are feeling. So how a lot of people really feeling under pressure to really help deliver on those huge policy challenges, but to do so with kind of more with less, so no kind of pay increases, and also that sense that ministers are talking them down. There's kind of a public narrative played out in the media with that lack of respect. So what you're saying, need for change and need to invest in the civil service to rebuild trust, to regain that mutual respect, and to have a strategy for doing all of that. Thank you so much, all of you, for those fantastic opening remarks. We have some questions coming in, so please keep those coming in. I guess my question to all of you, just very quickly, based on what you've all said, I think you all kind of touched on or alluded to the fact that these tensions have been there for a long time. They're not new. I think, Lucille, you said this is a concocted war. So my question then is, why is this so high profile at the moment? Why are we seeing so many of these individual high profile cases in the media? What's different now? Because it certainly feels, even if the tensions have been there for a long time and been managed differently, it feels much more toxic than it's ever been. So just your quick reflections on that before we go to the audience questions. Andrew, we haven't heard from you for a while, so I'll come to you for your thoughts on that.
First of all, not so new. If we go into the private sector, you will find the same toxicity increasing, not so much between chairman and CEO, but very much between the CEO and that critical line of management, which I call general management, but these are the big budget holders, the guy who's looking after the Singapore hub and so on. Why is that toxicity increasing? Because of the complexities in the market. The time now to get something, a service, a product, a brand, an image to the marketplace, well thought through, that time is becoming compromised. Press, media, shareholders are demanding a lot more. So those companies that have recognized that this tension is actually there and will not go away and will probably get worse are the ones that very first started by saying, who is in my top team? And it's not the board, it's not the C-suite, it is the general management with the board and the C-suite. So in effect, it is the PermSec and the DGs and so on, and they're one team. And the question that's put to them is, what is really happening here and how will we have successful strategy implementation? And by the way, no holds barred. And that's the big issue, Siobhan, when you give that permission so that you can speak freely. I know comments were made about speaking truth to power, but I have found nobody on this earth in senior positions that will speak truth to power when the engagement reality is negative. That's our challenge. How do we create a demanding situation and create a positive engagement so that people can speak?
Thanks, Andrew. Jonathan, so just your thoughts as well on why is it so bad at the moment, or has it been as bad as this before? But also picking up on what Andrew said there about the complexity of some of those challenges, as we see kind of delivery of net zero, for example, addressing our climate change and biodiversity goals, you know, the ongoing war in Ukraine. These things are long-term policy challenges. And as ministers need to have those quick wins, isn't this tension just going to get worse? Are we going to see more of these kind of high-profile resignations?
So, I mean, there were a number of high-profile departures of permanent secretaries, of which I was maybe one of the sort of most high-profile. But they were a moment in time. I mean, nobody ever sat down with me and explained why I was going, so I can only sort of speculate. But you know, it's not that hard to speculate because Dominic Cummings was very clear about the importance of driving through sort of barriers as he perceived them, and that sort of stopped when he left. With the one exception of Tom Scholar, but I think it would be a mistake to generalise from Liz Truss's premiership. I mean, who knows what happens next? Clearly, it would be a shame if that were to continue. So it's difficult right now to look at this. Was this a sort of moment in history, or is this the future? Certainly, I mean, Andrew's already referred to pressures that exist outside government. It's not uniquely in government, in central government at all. You know, the age of deference is over, isn't it? It's the amount of external scrutiny and challenge that ministers are under, the pressure that they're under. Goodness me. I mean, who would be a minister? Every morning you wake up and you know that you're going to be criticized, whatever you did yesterday. And the world of social media just making that sort of unbearable. So the pressure on these people who are generally not trained at all, or prepared for these roles at all. So I guess, you know, the changes to the sort of the political environment would be an obvious reason why it's getting more high profile. But as Andrew says, it's not new. I suppose, perhaps as Richard said, what is newer is that when permanent secretaries fall out of favour, they've just been pushed out rather than sort of moved. But you know, we'll have to wait, won't we, for a few years to see whether that's become the standard, or whether this was just a moment in history.
Thanks, Jonathan. Lucille, your thoughts on that question as well. I mean, you mentioned the narrative now that the kind of blob, you know, the civil service, there are, you know, I was looking on Twitter, there are serving MPs who are using this today to refer to the civil service. So do you see maybe things getting better, or do you see that narrative now becoming kind of embedded, and actually this toxicity is going to last going forward?
I mean, I'm always an optimist, so I hope it won't. But the current flow is definitely in that realm. I mean, there's been a number of articles written in terms of commentators around, particularly where the current government is at and the run up to the general election, and that this is going to get even more bitter, I would say, in terms of running up to that, in terms of what they've delivered or what they feel they haven't delivered, and who is responsible for that. So I think there is that inevitable blame culture, in that sense of that seems to be where they're positioning themselves. Some ministers are positioning themselves. So I think that, for me, you know, whilst I am an optimist, I can't see how that trajectory stops, given that, I suppose, political pressure that is on quite substantially at this moment in time. And yeah, like using disparaging words to refer to a group of people which doesn't actually deal with what the specifics are of individual issues or departments and so on, makes it really hard to try and undermine or to argue against in that sense.
Thanks, Lucille. I'm going to go to a question that's coming from Michael Keane. I think this probably was in response to what you were saying, Jonathan, about the transparency of policy advice. So Michael has asked, how would you envisage external scrutiny of policy advice working in practice?
It's a good question. So the closest thing we've got to it in the civil service already is the role of the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee. So as you will know, the National Audit Office has got sort of unlimited power to look into any work of the civil service and consider the extent to which civil servants advised in accordance with the principles in managing public money, in particular were the options proper value for money and were they legal and so on. And then after that's been done, the Public Accounts Committee holds permanent secretaries to account for that advice. And I think that's a good process, and it changes the behaviour of permanent secretaries. As I said earlier, it's not easy to tell a minister that something they want to do is poor value for money. But if you know that the National Audit Office are going to come and find out that you didn't tell them, and then you're going to be in front of a committee of parliamentarians who are going to say, well, why didn't you tell them? Then you're much more likely to do it. And it's easy to explain to the minister why you're having to advise, because that's the rule, and it will be subject to scrutiny. Now, if the Public Accounts Committee or the National Audit Office were to ask you any questions about matters of policy advice, you would say, and indeed permanent secretaries do say, I used to say a lot, I'm sorry, I think you'll find that is beyond the terms of reference of this committee. But there's no reason why it need be. No reason why the National Audit Office's role couldn't be extended to look into the extent to which our policy advice was evidence-based, that we had identified the delivery risks. For most of the rest of the public sector, teacher, a doctor, police officer, you're subject to external inspection for the quality of your work. No reason in principle why that couldn't happen for the civil service. Not just had you done your job right? Had you identified what the various choices were, or not, and how might you do that better in future? And preferably, this would be a change to the way the PAC works. You do that in advance of the policy decision being made, because the trouble with the sort of PAC model at the moment is it does rather tend to focus on, well, whose fault is it? Obviously, much better to get some scrutiny into the policy making before a decision is made, so that you've got a chance to improve the quality of it. But that's the basic proposition.
Thanks, Jonathan. Lucille, do you think officials would welcome that, having more transparency around the advice that they provided or that they are providing?
Yeah, I don't see. I mean, I suppose it's how you do that. I mean, I was just trying to think. I have an understanding of scrutiny in local government, and that's very much at the beginning process of that policy development, as opposed to, in a way, how it happens now in terms of that within a government department. You're more just those direct information to the minister, but that there is huge amounts of evidence and data that goes into those decision making. I suppose it's just, do you end up, I'd really need to think through how that would work in terms of it not making another barrier for change, in the sense of you're blocking up with the bureaucracy of that, showing that you're doing the right thing as opposed to doing the right thing and getting on with it in that sense. So I can't see that accountability or transparency would be an issue for any of our members.
Thanks, Cecile. And Andrew, I mean, you've obviously done a lot of kind of work across the public and the private sector. Do you see, what Jonathan is proposing? Is that something that happens more in the private sector? Is the kind of advice up to the senior people in the private sector more transparent, more open than it might be in a government setting, for example?
Funnily enough, no, neither. It varies completely. And I do like the last comment, which said it's how it's done. What was so interesting when I spent quite some time with ministers and civil servants was the degree of depth that the official went into to create a policy that made sense, that had a coherent argument, that was supported by evidence. What was the problem? Can I get on the minister's wavelength? When a CEO goes to a board, is the chair going to support me? When the chair is going to be challenged by the senior non-executive director, do I want to listen to this? So what is the key step is that quality of engagement. So we explored it. And we tried to understand just that simple phrase, what does it mean to get onto the minister's wavelengths? And two dimensions emerged. First, the lack of confidence or confidence of the minister to cope with such argument. And the second was the degree to which the minister was driven by evidence. And do we know which of these two dimensions was least represented? The degree to which the minister was driven by evidence. So I have a lot of sympathy for any perm sec that knows what they need to say. There is argument and evidence and good work done behind the scenes. But what do you do when you know you're going to present something and fundamentally you're going to be thrown out of the office? What is success here? Now, putting those perm secs under some sort of public scrutiny, what are you going to say? Are you going to say, yes, I did my work and the minister's at fault? Are you going to say, yes, but we're working something through so it sounds nebulous and a bit soft, or what? It's exactly the same arguments that I've heard on multinational boards, on major UN agencies. How do I position a message when the work behind the scenes is probably pretty good?
Interesting. So you're saying that might actually create other tensions, which then are difficult when that evidence comes out, when the advice.
And my experience of that, Siobhan, is it creates tensions you really don't want.
Interesting. One thing that struck me, I think it was something that you said, Jonathan, which maybe picks up on what Andrew has just said there as well, is I think you mentioned a sentence. You said ministers come in, who would want to be a minister? They come in, they're not trained, they're not prepared for the role that they're about to take on. And my question is there something more that could be done when new ministers are brought in and inducted to help them even understand that relationship between themselves and their officials and understand that role that civil servants have in terms of speaking truth to power? Because sometimes when I hear some of these very high profile, outspoken ministers and MPs at the moment, they seem to resent the kind of advice coming in from officials, as if officials are doing something wrong by offering them the kind of advice. So I wonder if there's something more that could be done in terms of training of ministers. Lucille, is this something that you have considered from the FDA perspective?
Not for training of ministers. I mean, I think we talk a lot with when we're running courses for unlocking the SCS. We get ex-ministers to talk to new potential SCS people about what their experience was with working with the SCS to start to think about those aspects. I mean, I think there is probably a need to start more of that political engagement in terms of that respect and dialogue. I just think the understanding of different or newer ministers has been a bit flawed in terms of what the role is between the civil servant and the minister in delivering those public services.
Thanks, Cecile. Jonathan, from your experience, are ministers given sufficient training in just understanding that relationship or not?
Our ministers aren't given any training or anything before they start the job. It is quite the most extraordinary element of this system in this country. I mean, just incredible. So it's helping ministers do their jobs more effectively, prepare for those jobs. Obviously, it's the job of the civil service to once they've started to explain the system as well as we can, and I think we do that pretty well, and we adjust accordingly in the way that I was saying earlier. But they just start day one with a new brief and no preparation for it. It's just absurd. Back in about 2014-15, I suggested Jeremy Hayward, when he was the cabinet secretary, I was working in the Ministry of Defence at the time, that wouldn't it be interesting if we got half a dozen permanent secretaries and half a dozen secretaries of state, current and previous, in a room together to explore how much that relationship works and what works well and what doesn't. And I mean, I wasn't a permanent secretary. I just thought it was interesting. And this was back in, 2014, 2015, something like that, so it's before Brexit. He did it. And the issue for government facilitated it. Peter Riddell. I was working for Philip Hammond, who was the Defence Secretary at the time. And it was a really interesting discussion in which secretaries of state were learning, really, for the first time. They were sort of thinking about this question about, that Andrew's written about for the first time, seemed to me. And I remember Philip Hammond actually saying sort of halfway through, "Oh, that's the first time I really sort of understood things from your point of view." And I said to Jeremy afterwards, that was interesting, wasn't it? I'm assuming that you do this thing from time to time. It's just that I wouldn't know about it because, I wouldn't normally organise it. He said, no, I think it's the first time it's ever happened. It's Jeremy Hillwood in his career. And I think sort of civil servants tend to think it's a little bit above their pay grade. But when Andrew was talking about the top management program, I was thinking, opportunities for ministers and civil servants to learn together, and us each to understand the other's perspective. There's room for so much more of that.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Well, Andrew, I was going to ask you about that. So you did mention the top management program. Is that something you would like to see brought back, or something similar along the lines maybe Jonathan has said there? And is there a need for just some of that basic good communication between permanent secretaries and the senior officials, but also that basic kind of education and training for ministers that Jonathan says they don't get any of at the moment?
I think Jonathan captured the issue. We definitely need to get Perm Secs and Secretary of States together in a room. I doubt whether we will ever have a top management program initiative. The time off work is too long. But there are two levels that are very interesting. One, as Jonathan has said, is to get the Perm Secs and Secretary of States in a room around one issue or one question and just see the other's perspective. The other is what many organizations, complex organizations, are doing, and that is to try and understand this particular relationship between this particular Secretary of State and Permanent Secretary. I was fascinated by that. And when I looked at present and previous Secs of State and Perm Secs, it takes 3 months for the relationship to break down. At the end of that 3-month period, it's very difficult to tell whether the relationship has broken down because of something called evidence or a different perspective or a different view and vision of how we move forward, or the chemistry factor. It's just the chemistry between us is wrong. And what very clever organizations do, some of the most ruthless, you may recall there was an American company called GE. After every year, they tried to get rid of the 20% lowest performing assets, people were sacked. What people don't know is that every time a CEO was appointed, that individual went through a 3-day process of psychometrics, of receiving feedback from their own subordinates, from the board. And why was that? Not because it was nice. It was because you needed to build the twin skills of sensitivity and resilience. And at 3 months, if there is a problematic relationship between a Secretary of State and Perm Sec, we have the technologies now to show this is a genuine difference of view. Perhaps the Perm Sec should be moved on. No. This is a chemistry factor issue. And if we just try to remold the expectations of each other and the understandings of each other, this can work. Now, what is the statistic from the private sector? Only 25% of CEO-chair relationships are functioning. The other 75% are not. So people are either muddling along or they're asking for help, but definitely when helped, that help can be powerful. And I think Jonathan is alluding to that. All I would say is there's one more thing. You can actually look at the dyad and help that dyad fairly early on in their period of tenure.
Thanks. So when you look at the 25%, 75%, then the public sector might not be doing that badly in comparison to that.
Believe you me, I believe the British public sector, but the British civil service stands out. And I don't say this to favor my colleagues. I say this as a comparison of having gone through 43 countries. This is not an idle statistic.
Thanks, Andrew. Richard, I want to bring you in on the next question, and it goes back to this idea of where do we go next, a possible model, if there is a different model proposed, for example, coming out of the review that Francis Maude is undertaking. And one of the things that you mentioned in your introduction was the possibility of having a model more akin to the French model, where you have a kind of political senior level at the top. I just want to ask, again, this isn't new either, is it? Because we did have, didn't we, in the UK, for a short while, I believe it, things called extended ministerial offices, where they did embed kind of political appointments into those offices. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, extended ministerial offices were, I think, more about giving Secretaries of State the greater say in the hiring of civil servants who were both in the kind of private office sphere, but also in the sort of policy side as well. And I mean, it's something I would love to hear Jonathan's reflections on, because I think there was a extended ministerial office in the Department for Education, and I think it lasted longest in DEFRA. But they were sort of eventually kind of done away with under Theresa May's time as Prime Minister. And I think it's an under-researched topic whether they worked or not, or the issues they had. But I think they faced a lot of hurdles to get extended ministerial offices into place, in terms of it was the time of the coalition, so it needed approval from both parties. You had to get approval or follow the guidelines from the Civil Service Commission to allow for the ministerial involvement in those appointments. But it does strike me as an interesting example of where a reform was tried, and perhaps we don't know whether it worked or not. And I wonder whether there is scope to look at an arrangement like an extended ministerial office that can be part of that process where, you know, don't want to use militaristic metaphors too much, but can be part of kind of the ceasefire, as it were, that we can arrive at between civil servants and ministers, and kind of maybe a reset in relations. I'm sorry to use your chair's prerogative, Siobhan, but I wonder if Jonathan has reflections on EMOs and whether there's this sort of germ of an idea there for further implementation.
Jonathan, over to you.
So to the extent that it is the case that ministers start a job without any experience in the subject matter, often without ever having run anything of any significance, and now they're in charge of everything, if you were trying to design a system to sort of tackle that, a permanent civil service would definitely be a really big part of the answer. You know, if there have been 9 education secretaries in the last whatever it is number of years, it's just as well as a permanent civil service, isn't it? That's how hard it would be if they had to start each time there was a new Secretary of State. Blimey. But on the other hand, you might, and this relates to your point, Richard, you might say a good way of bolstering the sort of political oversight of a department was for the politician in charge to be able to bring in a few people who were political, who everybody understood were, you know, conservative in the case of the current government, but complemented a Secretary of State who perhaps didn't have any managerial background, any understanding of the subject. And so long as it was clear that that's what they were doing, they were helping the minister to be an effective politician, overseer of the department, because what they bring a political awareness, but some expertise. That seems to me a good reform. I'm not sure that's quite what happened with extended ministerial offices. Maybe in some cases, maybe not so much. And as you say, it sort of tailed away a bit. But I would be interested in that as a way of addressing the issue of sort of ministerial inexperience. I think there's definitely something in that. The notion, though, more generally, that ministers should just be able to appoint whoever they want in our system, I think would be, you just can't do it. You know, those countries in which politicians are in charge of recruitment have got different constitutional arrangements more generally. I mean, I was appointed when I was in local government by politicians, so you can do it, but you know, the opposition was on the interview panel as well as the lead party. You know, if you invite the leader of the opposition to take part in the interview for permanent secretaries, well, that's a possibility, isn't it? In America, where the politicians again choose the civil servants, the top 4 layers working for them, the president has got much less power than the Prime Minister in the United Kingdom. If you give the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom the power to appoint whoever he or she wants to whatever jobs you want, that is not really, I mean, that is a far too centrally controlled system, unlike any other democracy.
Thanks, Jonathan. Richard, can I just check, because I'm going to put the same question to Andrew and Lucille, but in the extended ministerial offices that you're talking about as a potential compromise, were you saying not necessarily bringing in political people as well, but bringing in experts But the ministers could decide who those experts would be. So, I mean, it might be the same thing. They might obviously then turn to people of a certain political leaning. But I think, were you talking about maybe not political appointments, but kind of bringing in experts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a mix of both. There were kind of political appointments, people who would perhaps have been hired as special advisors in the normal run of things, but there were also officials brought in on shorter term contracts as on civil service terms, with those kind of civil service provisions to bring in particular expertise on a particular issue or to help drive a particular policy agenda. And that was a slight kind of change in terms of their employment contracts, that they were brought in to kind of help the minister specifically.
Thanks. I'm just looking at the time. I can't believe how fast the time has gone. So Lucille and Andrew, this will be your last comments, unfortunately, but I'd like to ask both of you your thoughts on allowing ministers to bring in kind of, experts themselves, or as possibly might be coming out in the Maud kind of report, maybe having a slightly political layer at the top of the civil service. Obviously, Jonathan has set out a lot of the obvious reasons why that might not be a good thing in our case. Lucille, to you first.
Yeah, I completely agree with Jonathan. I think you have to be very careful about how we approach something like that. I mean, not only around terms and conditions. I mean, the big issue at the moment is you've got experts in the civil service who are not being paid anywhere near the level that they should be paid in terms of comparable external experts. And I think to then bring it, I mean, I certainly think bringing in a politicized layer, if, like Jonathan said, if it's to support the minister in developing their expertise and that card, then that's a slightly different process from actually saying, well, they'll be employees of the civil service and they will do whatever we want them to do in that sense. So, we have got the SPADS process, and there are ways that people can get that expertise, but I'd be very uncomfortable with it, just obviously without seeing the detail, but also, like Richard said, that reflection on what did or didn't work in relation to those extended ministerial offices.
Maybe GGF will have to do a bit of digging and do a bit of learn from the extended.
Yes, that would be good.
Andrew, your final thoughts on kind of the risks or benefits of a more political top layer?
Jonathan and Lucille have actually captured it. By all means, short-term contracts. Any advisor you want, or specialist input you want, by all means. But in every other walk of life that I've been, from the US to Australia to Canada, even to China, the idea that the minister comes in and appoints another layer, the chair comes in and wants to get rid of the CEO comes in and wants to get rid of the director of marketing who's been successful up to this point, it's heavily resisted for one reason. That person who's come in has not gone through their transition experience. What they're doing is they're giving some sort of experience from the past into this role without understanding the nature and climate and culture and ways of working and all those elements that make a difference in this department right now. That is the number one danger point. And if consultants were going to be honest with you, they would say, please don't make these significant appointments until 6 months from now when you know what you're doing. What did I find with ministers? I have to say, I came away just like the public servants with tremendous respect for ministers. Yes, many have not been trained or developed. Yes, some have not even been to university. But when you see them operate, there's something different. And what I notice with ministers is that if they've been in that department before, their transition time is about 3 months. For those who've not been in that department before, it's about 6 months. Do you know the equivalent in the private sector of big multinationals? It's a year. So here we do have a very impressive group of people who possibly after 6 months could make a very informed decision. It could be called political, but it's informed. The problem with making it straight away is that decision is not informed. And there we found real problems. The very person that minister appointed now in 6 months' time may be seen to be a poor appointment. It's the information, it's not the political bit.
Thanks, Andrew. And I have to say, when I was in the civil service in the Cabinet Office, we used to get delegations from all around the world coming to learn from us. It goes back to your point about kind of the British civil service being a kind of world leading, to learn from the British civil service, because not least its impartiality. So I think we would do that at quite a high cost. That is the end of our webinar today. I have to say a huge thank you to Andrew, to Lucille, to Jonathan, and to Richard. Thank you for giving us so much of your time and your expertise. To the audience, if you are civil servants, public servants at the moment, I hope that has been helpful. I hope you are not feeling under too much pressure. A huge thank you from me for everything you continue to do. We will have sent you a questionnaire. If you'd like to take a few minutes to fill that in, it just means we can keep giving you exactly the type of webinars that are most useful for you. We will also be circulating to everybody who registered a recording of this webinar, so you can watch it all again, you can share it with your colleagues, and there will be a write-up, an article with the key messages that have come out of today's conversation, and that will be sent round in a short while as well. But from me, wherever you are today, a very big thank you for joining us, and I hope we see you very soon in one of our webinars again. Thanks very much to all of you. Enjoy the rest of the day. Cheers. Goodbye.
Thank you.